everyone. Welcome to the latest episode of Overeducated, Underloved Millennials. As always, I'm joined by my wonderful co-host, Katie. Katie, how are you?
Good, thank you. It's been a very hectic week, hasn't it, in politics?
Oh, when is it not? When is it not?
Harold Wilson's famous line, he's a long time in politics.
I actually feel like this week it's been quite hard to choose topics, partly because we've had elections in Bulgaria, Brazil, Bosnia, Latvia, Quebec. We've had the whole issues here. There's something else as well that happened. Off the top of my head, I can't remember. It just feels like there's been lots of stuff happening. Oh, Iran, of course, that was the other one I was thinking. So much stuff happening. It's really hard to.
It's been
choose.
A very busy week. It's been a very busy week internationally, and I think that obviously, as a podcast that likes to remain global in our focus, the globe has really been quite busy this week. A lot's been going on. We've got Russian retreats, Russia with the conscription, Ukraine's successes. It's been a crazy week in politics.
Yeah, absolutely. I think so. So today, obviously, as we can only, we don't want to literally. I feel like we could probably talk for an entire afternoon for about 5 hours if we wanted to, but we are going to focus on sort of two topics and then do something a bit lighter at the end. So we're going to talk about what we were referring to as the Tory chaos from their conference today, the last sort of couple of days. It's been absolutely mad. I think chaos is the word, and it's not just us using words like that. The BBC used the word civil war this morning.
Like a sort of summary, because it's a bit difficult to keep up with everything. So it'd be nice to know where we're at the moment.
And then we're also going to talk about elections in Quebec, which I will explain where Quebec is and what Quebec is. People who don't know, it's a Canadian province which has a history of independence movements, and I think not only do I think it's a very interesting case in its own right, I think there's also some very interesting lessons we can take from Scotland. And then after that, to conclude, we're going to talk about us. We're going to talk about the sort of things we like to do to keep ourselves sane when we're not dealing with PhDs in politics. So, starting with the Tory Party conference, I think it's fair to say it was definitely a chaotic few days. So I guess the starting point was really when Laura Kuenssberg had her, Sunday show, and she invited both Liz Truss on as, an interview, and also invited Michael Gove as a guest. And it was very clear, I got the impression my local MP, Michael Gove, was maybe there to cause a bit of trouble, to cause a bit of mischief.
Yes, there was a bit of dissent in the ranks.
Yeah, absolutely there was. There absolutely was. And so even before Liz Truss's interview, he was very critical of the removal of the 45 top rate of tax. He said that I think his exact term was, it brought into question the party's morals, I think was the exact quote, or something like that, which is a very damning statement. And yeah, it was very, very critical of Liz Truss. He was very sort of, almost trying to, being very critical. And I get the impression it was very much, again, it feels like he's just sort of trying to cause mischief.
I think that Michael Gove is a very interesting character, and we've touched on this briefly before. I will say that he's a character as a Labourite that I really don't like, which is possibly a really good thing as a Conservative. And one of the reasons that I don't like Michael Gove is he's incredibly astute at reading the political landscape. He's very astute. He's very good at picking. He has previously been a kingmaker, as they call him, in the Conservative Party. He's backed winning candidates, and he's had really good insight. I think that it's incredibly telling, the position that Liz Truss is in at the moment. And I do, again, as I said, think it touches on what we said when she was first elected leader. The issue that she's having at the moment as a Conservative Prime Minister is she was elected by the party. She was not elected by the MPs. And I think this is the issue that the Conservatives are having at the moment in when they are proposing incredibly far-sweeping and unpopular, let's say. I think we can all say, looking at the polls that have come out, as a Labour member, I was very happy, but, looking at the polls that have come out, incredibly unpopular policies across the United Kingdom, tax cuts, etc., that we discussed last week. They're great with the membership of the Conservatives. They're not so great with the actual MPs who need a wider demographic to get elected. And the issue that she's having at the moment, which I feel that Michael Gove's position and his appearance summarised perfectly is the policies that she is introducing hit the Conservative base. They do not hit the electorate. And her comparisons to Margaret Thatcher are redundant in the sense of Margaret Thatcher was elected by the MPs because the electoral system of the Conservative Party was different back in the day. So she did have the MPs' support because she was elected by them.
Yeah,
and
no,
Liz Truss doesn't.
I agree with lots of that. I think that point about who elected her and who sort of chose her leader is crucial. I think so. Just to very quickly, so I mean, there's so much happened over the last, particularly yesterday, it just seemed to all kick off. So, so obviously after this pressure from Michael Gove, and also bizarrely, it seems Grant Shapps is also driving the cabal as well, which ironically, given how terrible he was as transport secretary, I wouldn't trust him to drive anything. But
Johnny Mercer as well. Johnny Mercer has sent direct mails to his constituents stating that he doesn't support the policies that Liz Truss is.
Even Dean Doris, who bloody voted for Liz Truss, seems to now be turning on her. It's quite crazy. So yeah, then there was this U-turn, this quite dramatic U-turn where they decided they weren't going to get rid of the top 45p rate, which I guess is a good thing. Again, I like to give credit where credit's due. However, it was very clear it was very much. I remember I saw the statement in the morning when Kwasi Kwarteng announced it. This idea, we are listening, and I think it just very much, even though he said that at the start, then the statement itself did scream very much, all right, you guys don't like it, so fine, we won't do it.
It was basically, you lot have moaned, so fine, because you won't stop moaning. Which is so bad.
It's especially bad because because Liz Truss, one of the first things she said as Prime Minister was, I will push through unpopular policies come what may. That was such a big point she made. So the fact that she U-turned so quickly, regardless of what you think of the policy, and we both think it was a terrible policy, it just undermines her premiership massively. And I think we've seen, that arguably, I would argue, was the sort of the match that lit this kind of chain of events that we've seen, this sort of chaos of the last couple of days. So just to very quickly summarize the madness of yesterday in particular. So early in the morning, Liz Truss was asked. Before that, there was a statement I saw from Suella Braverman where she was asked about the top rate of 45p, and she actually criticised the government decision to U-turn. So that was the first thing. And then the issue of benefits and the increase in benefits in line with inflation came up. And Liz Truss, I believe, was asked in an interview whether or not she would support the increase in line with benefits like Boris Johnson did, and she couldn't give a straight answer. And then very quickly afterwards, Cabinet Minister Penny Mordaunt came along with Ian Duncan Smith and a couple others, and outright said, well, actually, yes, we do support this policy. In response, Suella Braverman again, she popped up a lot yesterday, actually, thinking about it. She came out and she gave, because we've talked about before, she's very, very critical of people who claim benefits. So she was very much coming out and saying, oh, we absolutely have to cut benefits. I disagree, sort of thing. And incredibly, she also sort of, which I think is a line that that some Tories will try and use a lot. She tried to basically put workers against benefit claimants. And she sort of said, well, how is it fair that benefit claimants get a 10% increase if, workers don't? First of all, my response to that is, well, maybe workers should. Secondly, you forget the obvious point.
That is join a trade union because your line of wage should be in line with inflation. That's a terrible argument.
But the obvious point against that is a lot of people, I think it's about 40% of the people on universal credit, are in full-time work. They're already so you're putting two groups of people against each other, and actually there's a lot of overlap.
Which the overlap that has actually been increased and has actually become an actual thing under the Conservative government. Let's not sully the water here. We had a Labour government beforehand that championed working tax credits, etc., to incentivise and greater give people, the national minimum wage, to give people incentive to go to work, to help people, to make work actually pay for workers. We're in an economy at the moment of 0 hours contracts, of trade unionists having to fight for basic rights and basic recognition and wages for an honest day's work. And then she's going to sit there and say, oh, well, actually, if you work, you're far better off and you actually deserve much more, help from the government. Well, hang on a minute. People are working and they're still having to go to food banks. Let's not ignore those statistics where the majority of food bank occupants in certain areas of England are actually public sector workers. Do the government sets their wages? So I found Suella Braverman, and we said this when she first was put in the cabinet, her arguments and her attitude are firmly stuck in 2010. There is no basis for what she's saying and for the policy decisions that she's making in 2022. There's no basis for it. And to add on as well, she actually attended a talk, I believe it was yesterday, I saw a tweet from her, I think it was with the Telegraph or the Times, where she said that her dream, so they said to her, what's your policy dream? Oh, my dream is to see a big plane full of migrants leaving the UK headed to Rwanda. Hang on a minute, we've got like a massive crisis that's going on. You're all arguing over benefit inflation rates and wages, etc. And your dream is to deport people. Really? How nearsighted is that? And I think that it links on to what we were saying, Adam. This is populism. She's trying to carry on with the popular policies. And actually, as the polls are showing, it's drying up because there's no substance to them. There's no substance, which is causing the infighting because they've seen all of the poll figures. They know that they've got a general election in 2 years. And under that polling, the Tories would have 60 seats left. Yeah, so I think MPs are just absolutely, you know, running around like headless chickens trying to figure out how to keep their seats.
It's, yeah, I think I was going to raise one of Bradman's comments because I distinctly remember we talked about the cabinet saying, be careful what we wish for regarding Priti Patel, because for all of Priti Patel's faults, I never got the impression, as you know, sometimes she might come across as quite nasty, but I never got the impression that she gleefully, you know, enjoyed sort of the horrible aspects of her job. Not in the same way, because there was something about the way Suella Braverman was talking about it. It was almost as if she got some weird sort of sick pleasure out of it. There was a really weird sort of enjoyment in it. And it was just almost seemed like it was almost like, yeah, it was like Priti Patel's sort of policy, but somehow even it just made me so sick to my stomach.
I mean, I would disagree. I think Priti Patel did get a kick out of it, especially I think with the allegations of bullying, etc. I think that she actually got a kick out of the power that she could exert over people, but that's a different conversation. But I agree with you in the sense of there was this sort of weird wry smile that she had of like, yeah, I can't wait to watch that plane take. That she would personally be there, like salivating over this notion, but this is I think the real time benefits that would bring to this country and the people that are in this country that are struggling at the moment are virtually non-existent. That, you know, what so taking migrants of working age, putting them on a plane and sending them to Rwanda in a process that costs us millions and millions of pounds, right? We're meant to look at that, and that's going to make us feel full. That's going to give us food. That's going to give us heat. It's going to give working people none of those things. If anything, it's actually going to cut the purse strings even tighter and make them pull even tighter, because we have an issue in this country at the moment with an aging population that no one is addressing. And I think that one of the main things that the Conservatives are having a problem with at the moment is all of their budgetary plans cost money. None of them raise money, including this immigration policy. Everything costs. Nothing is making money. So this U-turn on the 45p in the pound tax thing, it is not going to raise any additional income to pay for the things that they have also implemented that will cost the country billions. So even though they've U-turned on this, which is, yeah, a big point, and we know why they've done it, we've outlined why they've done it, it is not actually reconciling the main issues that the British public have with their budgeting and their economic strategy. It does nothing. It's a token gesture.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I mean, it was very, yeah, it was very much a case. Obviously, it was good that policy was U-turned, but clearly there was a whole lot more in that mini budget, which we discussed, that had issues. So I think I want to talk about two more things. First of all, division within the cabinet. And I also want to talk about Liz Truss's speech, which I know you didn't watch, but I'm happy to fill you in. Yeah, so regarding,
sure, it was a perler.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, so division in the cabinet, I get the impression, well, first of all, there seems to be two divisions within the Tory party. First of all, within the cabinet, sort of, I guess you could say, sort of people like Penny Mordaunt on one side, people like sort of Suella Braverman on the other side, who, again, it shows the sort of, you get the impression there's a lack of authority within the Liz Truss premiership if it's so easy for these two sides to come out quite publicly and effectively contradict each other. It just shows a complete lack of cohesion. It shows a complete lack of sort of unity in the cabinet. And also, there seems to be, of course, this divide on the backbenches, the cabinet versus the backbenches. And I think one of the big problems the Conservative Party has, because they've been in government now so long, is that backbench is starting to fill up with a lot of former ministers and a lot of people with access to grind. The most obvious two being Michael Gove and Grant Shapps, of course, who have made a lot of headlines recently. So things are going to get quite difficult for them both, I think, internally, if Liz Truss doesn't, put the hammer down also and try and get some unity. And also, I think with the backbenchers, that could be an issue.
Just a quick point on that as well. Neither of those have to be death tolls to governments, right? So I think it's really important to talk about this from a political perspective using history from the UK, okay? And when you're a prime minister, you can choose to control your cabinet and your party in different ways, right? Harold Wilson famously liked to have people in his cabinet that actually politically hated each other because he thought that it was the best way of getting policy, actual good centre ground policy that people can agree with. So you used to have, your Jim Callaghan and Barbara Castle, who absolutely hated each other, working together in the same cabinet. And it requires a prime minister that is able to control those personalities and is able to get the best out of those people, right? Putting them in places that they excel in, okay, and that they can provide good policy in. Also, when it comes to backbenchers, it's not an issue. The Labour Party has very, very vocal backbenchers. I mean, for goodness sake, Jeremy Corbyn, John McDermott, McDonald, like it's Dennis Skinner. We have very, very vocal backbenchers. You can actually harness that and you can use that as a part of your party to make it a broad church, okay? It doesn't have to be an issue. But what it relies on is the importance of the whip and the importance of the party line. And the issue that we have here with Liz Truss is, previously, as a politician, she's been very, very good at parroting the party line. She consistently refers back to the party line. It's how she's got through many, many portfolio positions. It's how she's got into cabinet positions before. David Cameron famously said, oh, she's a very good speaker. She's a very good communicator. And in that, what that means is, from a previous prime minister's perspective, is she talks the party line. She can give people the party line. She doesn't budge off of it. Okay. In the Foreign Office, she's had situations where she's, the Foreign Office is a very sort of flashy, nice portfolio to have because you get loads of photos, shaking hands with people and all this stuff. But when you actually look below the level of that, she hasn't actually given that many good trade deals, really. That for us post-Brexit, she said that the trade deal with the US was going to be like that. We don't have a trade deal with the US still. It's still very much up in the air, but it's very sort of conjecture and talking. And the issue that you've got with Liz Truss now, she's in a position of power where she not only sets the narrative, she also has to make sure that the whips are making sure that people are sticking to it. And the only way your whips work is when polling is on your side and there's a chance that your MPs can retain their seats. So the issue that Liz Truss has at the moment is she's put in a position where she needs to control the narrative, where she has never, in her time as a constituency MP and in her time as a minister with portfolio, she has never, ever, ever set any line for a policy. She has always followed the party line. And this is an issue that we have in politics in Britain at the moment. When you elect people to these ministerial positions that have consistently just backed the party line, there's no way of controlling the infighting. There's no way of because a lot of people are looking to vie and get their position and to move up. Liz Truss has previously kept her head below the parapet, and it's just not working. You can't whip people if you have no conviction, if you have no line, if you have no ability to control that and to also minimise the poll impact. It's a terrible position that she's gotten herself into.
Yeah, I think the polling shows that quite clearly, that it's not going well. So I want to quickly move on because I don't think there's really much else to say, to be honest. It's just as we're calling it in the title, it's just chaos. I get the impression. So she had her speech today, and to be honest, it was weird. So I think if I'm looking at it from a political science perspective, quality of the speech, I think she did quite well. I think she gave quite a good speech in terms of how she spoke. She was a lot less sort of robotic and awkward than she has appeared in previous interviews. I think part of the reason for that is she was definitely, to use a football analogy, playing at home. She was definitely, in her own stadium, as it were, because she was, I mean, she was surrounded by supporters. She was being cheered a lot. There was a quite awkward moment about 5 minutes in where, I don't know if you saw yet, if you had a chance to look on Twitter, two protesters somehow got in, and they were Greenpeace protesters, and they had a big sign up that said who voted. I think what it was like, what is your mandate, or something like that, and they were just sort of shouting. But I think in a weird way, even that she actually dealt with quite well, because they were obviously dragged out, and obviously then there was a huge applause, applauding the leader, trying to make her sort of feel better, and she actually did deal with it quite well. Particularly if you remember when Theresa May was heckled and given her P45 a couple of years ago. In comparison, actually, I think she dealt with it quite well in her defence. However, obviously, there's a difference between style and substance. And in terms of substance, it was very much, you got the impression she was really playing safe. She didn't want to upset anyone. She didn't want to sort of cause another run on the pound or upset anyone in the markets. It was very much a sort of, I am going to deliver growth. And then there were some populist elements about what's now being called the anti-growth coalition, basically attacking the Labour Party, attacking the Lib Dems, attacking the SNP. So it was very much, a populist speech aimed at, at the members. And yeah, so I think in terms of substance, I don't really want to talk about it that much, because there's not really much to say, to be honest.
Which again links back to my previous point. You cannot get better in the polls if you do not provide substantive policy, which your MPs can be whipped to. Like, there's nothing.
Yeah, I think particularly, the only thing I really want to talk about is the fact that when she attacked Labour, the Lib Dems, and the SNP, she didn't actually make any credible arguments as to why they were wrong. She basically just said they're anti-growth and they're woke liberal weirdos. It was basically just sort of, I don't know, those aren't exact quotes, but it was very much just sort of insulting them without actually giving any credible arguments. And given that the polls strongly show at the moment that the majority of people are backing, well, mostly the Labour Party, but the SNP and the Lib Dems too, if you put them all together, just sort of slagging them off isn't going to win voters back. You need to put forward a credible argument and try and persuade people, right? So to me, it was very much aimed at the base, not at the. I think it was a speech for the members, for the base, not for the country.
I would agree, but I would just like to maybe finish this section with reminding Liz Truss of what Margaret Thatcher said, which is, if you have to start making personal jibes at people, you've already lost the argument.
Actually, that's one more point I want to make. Right at the start of her speech, she talked about how terrible her upbringing was in the 80s and the 90s, and how terrible the economic prospects were for many of her friends. And then she tried to blame the local Labour council in Leeds.
Who was in government in the 80s and early?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think she might need to. She'll be very shocked when she finds out. But it was just bizarre, because she always made it sound like Leeds was some weird independent socialist republic which the Labour Party controlled on its own, without any sort of
socialist republic of Leeds.
Yeah, there was no influence from the central government at all. Margaret Thatcher had nothing to do with it, of course. But yeah, it was such a bizarre. Yeah, it makes no sense. But I guess these sorts of populist platitudes never really do they?
No, they don't. I mean, you only have to look at a Trump rally to understand that. Like, they don't have to have any sort of logic behind them, really. You can say anything and just put it on a flag or a hat.
So I want to ask one, before we move on, I want to ask one final question. I'm going to make a mug of us both by making us do a prediction. So think forward to our first Wednesday of 2023, our first episode in 2023. I know it feels like quite a long way, but it will come quickly, I promise. These things always do. Will Liz Truss still be Prime Minister of the UK come the first Wednesday of 2023?
No. No. The this is going to sound really bad, but if the bookies are running even odds on you not making it to Christmas, it's not looking good, because they've managed to call Brexit, they've managed to call everything. And I would say, with the damage that she's doing nationally, we have this wonderful thing in the United Kingdom for international listeners, and also for UK listeners as well, called the 30% magic ceiling. And when somebody breaks through that 30% of the vote share ceiling in a poll, it is a death toll to that leader. And Labour have not only broken through that ceiling, they've absolutely smashed it. In Red Walls, they're polling on 62% Westminster voting intention. So to me, I don't think that this position that she's in is reparable. So no, I don't. What do you think?
See, I am inclined to agree, but there is this small part of me that thinks surely the Conservative Party knows that would surely, you can't just replace the leader again.
You've got 2 years to sort it out. And if you listen to what Jacob Rees-Mogg was saying, they're vying for a January 2025 election. So you've got a full 2 years to turn it around. And a week is a long time in politics. 2 years is a hell of a long time.
Yeah, I think that is a really important point. I think lots of pundits are sort of lazily suggesting it'll be May 2024. I understand why, because obviously that's in sort of the makeup every 5 years in May. But of course, technically, the last election was December 2019. So I could easily see a situation with the Tories, if the polls don't improve, they just hold it out until January 2025. Technically, maybe to keep the turnout low or something, possibly. But I think that's a really important point to make to finish off. So moving on to Quebec, and so for those who don't know, Canada is so assuming people know what Canada is, right? It's a country to the north of the United States. It's a former British colony. I'm trying to explain the situation without being too patronizing. So
no, please be patronizing, because just a note to listeners now, as we were talking about imposter syndrome, I know absolutely nothing about this, so I'm learning as well.
So Canada is a federal country made up of provinces, but kind of like the American equivalent of states. And every single province is a majority-speaking English province. They all speak, like the United States, they're predominantly English speakers, with the exception of one, and that is Quebec. Quebec is a majority French-speaking province. And this dates back all the way to the 1700s, when the French had a colony in North America, and as the British sort of swept through North America, colonizing it and sort of taking it over, the last point of call, the last part of Canada that they took over was Quebec. So despite the fact it was then taken from the French, given to the British, it still very much kept this distinct French identity. And when Canada was created during what was called the process of Confederation in 1867, this was taken into account. There were French-speaking Québécois, they're called, at this confederation. They played a part to make sure Quebec was given its own rights, its own sort of freedoms within Canada. So this has always been it's always been a distinct nation. It's always been a distinct sort of region or part of Canada. That's just how Canada's always been. And then historically Quebecois nationalism and identity was always seen as quite an internal right wing, your traditional protectionist sort of nationalism. However, in the late 1960s, a new party emerged in Quebec called the Parti Québécois, which, to give a very lazy comparison, effectively is very similar to the SNP. It's a centre-left pro-independence party, and it effectively tried to it didn't try. It succeeded in sort of redesigning Quebecois nationalism. It made it look more progressive. It made it look more left-wing. There was always still there was always right wings. There was always still little right-wing factions to it, but it predominantly became, like the SNP, a more sort of left-wing progressive looking type of, attempted to look like a more progressive left-wing type of nationalism. And then, so really from 1970 to 2018, there was a sort of battle between the Parti Québécois, which was the pro-independence party, and the Quebec Liberal Party, which was sort of the anti-independence party. And these two parties held power, just these two. It was kind of like a duopoly where they take turns effectively winning and losing elections up until 2018. And in that period, which is very important, in both 1980 and in 1995, but while the Parti Québécois was in government, Quebec did hold two referenda, I should say, on its independence, or sovereignty as it's called there. In the first referendum, the No campaign won by 60% to 40%. In the second campaign, in 1995, it was 51% to 49% to stay in. So it was very, very close. There was people sort of in that week saying, "Oh God, we're going to lose Quebec. It's going to become independent," and it just about
becoming independent. Just to make it a little bit clearer, becoming independent from Canada, because obviously, is it my understanding that the Queen is still the head of the Queen King? But still still the head of state of Canada.
So because of Canada's colonial past as part of the British Empire, it has kept, similar to Australia and New Zealand, it has kept Queen. So these votes were on Quebec becoming an independent state from Canada, similar to what we saw in Scotland in 2014. And so in 1995 it was very, very close, but the No campaign just won. And since then, interestingly, there has been a decline in support for the Parti Québécois. It seems like, despite the fact that it was very, very close, the issue has somewhat been settled. But so what's happened? So fast forwarding to 2018, as I said, it's always just been Parti Québécois and the Liberals. We saw a new party in the 2018 Quebec elections, the election prior to what happened on Sunday, a new party called the Coalition for Quebec's Future absolutely smashed it. They smashed they smashed both the Liberals and the Parti Québécois and won a majority. And what was interesting about this party, it was a conservative party ideologically. It was Quebecois, it was pro-Quebecois nationalists, so very much, emphasizing Quebecois identity, emphasizing the importance of the French language, but it was specifically anti-independence. One of their key promises was, we will never hold an independence referendum. We will protect Quebec's identity, but we will never hold an independence referendum. And this was very electorally successful. It, won a majority. And we just had, so this party has been in power for 4 years, since 2018. And it's, sorry, just to be clear, its acronym is the CAQ. So when we start talking about election results in more detail, when I refer to the CAQ, that's what I mean. So the CAQ has been in power for 4 years, and they've had quite a strong, I'd say quite a protectionist form of nationalism in Quebec has emerged. So one example was what's referred to as Bill 21, which was a new policy on secularism, which put much harsher penalties and effectively banned public servants from wearing religious symbols. So you couldn't wear a headscarf, you couldn't wear a cross. You were, if you were a teacher, if you were a civil servant, any sort of public office, you were not allowed to wear any religious symbols. And also much more harsher policies regarding the French language. So this was referred to as Bill 96, where they sort of placed further policies on restricting the use of English, for example, in workplaces. So in workplaces, the primary language now has to be French. There's also a route now legally, if a company that's doing business in Canada doesn't offer a French language service, their service in French to the Québécois, to Quebec, they can be sued. So we're seeing cases where companies now just don't do business in Quebec because they don't, can't afford to get a French version of their website or something. So this is definitely an interesting turn. So it seems this party has effectively turned away from sort of constitutional politics and back towards more sort of traditional ethnic nationalism, if that makes sense, which I think is fascinating. So sorry, this has been a very long-winded explanation, but I feel like it's important for the context.
But it's quite worrying though as well. It is interesting.
Yeah. So on Sunday, the CAQ had its first provincial election where it was defending itself. It was the incumbent party, and it absolutely smashed it. So just to give you an idea, the party came first. It won 90 out of 125 seats in the Quebec National Assembly. So absolutely, I think over 70% of the seats. And it did this with just 40.97% of the vote. So its vote share went up by about 3.5%. And the reason why it won so many seats was because the next four parties all had between 12 and 14%. So the Liberal Party had 14%, but they came second in terms of seats. Quebec Solidaire had 15. So Quebec Solidaire is a radical left-wing pro-independence party. They came third on seats with 11, but they actually had 1 more percent than the Liberals did. But that's first past the post for you. And then the party Québécois.
I was just about to ask, is it first past the post?
Yeah, to be clear, it's a first past the post system. The Parti Québécois, which of course used to be, the dominant force, it held these 2 independence referenda back in the 80s and 90s. They're down to just 3 seats. But interestingly, they did, again, because first past the post is weird, they actually got 14.6, so they got 0.3 higher than the Liberals did. But because of how their vote share is spread out, they lost more of their seats. And also, what was also fascinating, we saw the emergence of a new party in Quebec, which was the Quebec Conservative Party, which usually, it's not a new party, it's always existed, but it's usually not done particularly well. They got 12.92% of the vote, which was an increase of over 10% from the previous election, but they didn't win any seats because first past the post is a terrible system, which doesn't proportionally represent anybody. So I think that first of all, just to me, shows just how disproportionate first past the post is in principle and how it just doesn't represent the views of people particularly well. And also, I think it's just fascinating that we have seen, after sort of the issue of independence was settled in Quebec, we have now seen the emergence of a new sort of nationalism, which very much goes back to the base instincts of nationalism without talking about independence. I think that's fascinating.
Which is interesting because I think it kind of, that's very fascinating. Thank you for your explanation. I think it's very interesting on an international scale, as we were talking last week about, globalization versus, the introversion of nations, which is happening, and isolationism. And that seems a lot more of an isolationist national perspective, because obviously with the nationalism that the SNP were touting, it was to go out into the globe and to be part of bigger things, but on their own terms. Whereas this seems very much insular.
Yeah, I mean, but that's the interesting thing, right? So yeah, culturally it is very, your traditional protectionist, insular sort of nationalism. But of course, the party still has this commitment: we will never have an independence referendum,
which is fascinating.
Which I think, if I'm being a cynic, I suspect part of that is because they know electorally it's not viable. As you can see, the Parti Québécois has just collapsed. They were promising an independence referendum within the next sort of Québécois parliament if they won a majority. So really, it suggests this might be a strategic thing. But the reason why, one of the big reasons why I wanted to talk about this was particularly, sorry, did you have a question?
No, sorry, I was just going to say, strategically, yes. Could there be an economic, I was going to say, could there be an economic incentivization to this, as obviously with regards to the laws that they've passed with regards to speaking, religious symbols, etc., which, by the way, I totally disagree with all of those. But anyway, for a variety of reasons, as an atheist, I still believe that anybody should be able to express their religious beliefs how they want to, because, hello, freedom. But it's obviously having an economic impact into the area. So could you argue that if they were to then go for independence, they've technically, with their cultural laws, made their economy less viable?
Yeah, so they've definitely. I mean, obviously they would deny this, and they'd probably also say it helps support local French-speaking businesses as well. I'm sure that'd be their argument. But yeah, so obviously it does. I don't think massively, because I'm sure if you're a big company.
To think of the logic,
I think yeah. So I think primarily it's going to be electoral strategy. I think also the fact there's been 2 referendums on it and they've lost both times, I think people just think it's a settled issue. So I think that might just be a general thought within the party. Even though they are proudly Quebecois, they just take the view of, this issue's done. It was an issue of the past. It's been settled. And also, I think there probably is an economic argument, right? Particularly as we go into quite very uncertain economic times globally. The idea of sort of cutting yourself off from a country the size of Canada, which is an economically quite big country, it would be, there are many arguments why that would not be a particularly smart thing to do. So,
especially when you're part of Canada and you've got that trade agreement with the United States and Mexico, that would be a huge thing to take away.
Yes, absolutely. So the reason why we're talking about this, not only because I think it's fascinating, and also because Quebec is a case study. I use my PhD, which is why I'm particularly interested in it. I do want to also talk about what this means for Scotland. So obviously Canada and the UK are different countries, but I think they are probably actually quite comparable in lots of ways, because of the fact they have a national minority that has a very particular, or used to have a very successful pro-independence party. They use a sort of majoritarian sort of electoral system, which I know Scotland doesn't use, but still you could argue it's much. But so basically what I'm trying to say is I think politically Canada is quite similar to the UK. So I think you can make some comparisons. So I guess one could come to the conclusion based on this, is the way to kill the SNP to have a second independence referendum and make sure you win it. Because if you do win it, then as we've seen in Quebec, it would kill the issue, and that would be it, right? I mean, obviously there's a lot of ifs there, and I'm sure you're going to raise some of them, but that's just a hypothesis I've raised based on this observation from Quebec.
I see what you're saying, but as somebody who believes that the future of UK policy is central ground, I'm very, very disconcerted. Well, centre-left ground. I'm very disconcerted by the rise of the right-wing nationalism in Quebec when bringing that up. As I said previously, left or right, not an issue for me. Both are wrong if they're on the extreme. And I don't want to see similar forms of nationalism being implemented regionally in the UK, whether it be England, Scotland, Wales. Whilst I think that certain policies, like with example with regards to French language speaking, etc., in the UK, when it comes to Gaelic and Welsh, etc., there should be more funding for those for those programs of teaching children the native language of the country. But I I question the motive here, and I question the fallout from that. Do I think that there should be a second referendum? I would be a hypocrite if I was to say no, because I want there to be a second referendum on Europe, because I think that everybody needed the information that they've got. Do I think there's going to be a second referendum in Scotland? No, because I think the SNP know that they're not going to win that referendum. I still don't think that they've got the grounds. It's actually aren't Scottish people polling more in favour of the union now than at that time previously?
I think it's sort of I think it's basically 50-50. It goes up and down.
It will teeter, but I don't know. To me, I think it's incredibly risky. I wouldn't. Again, I couldn't say no, don't have another referendum, because I would be an absolute hypocrite, because I think we should have one on Europe. But I don't know. I think there's a lot of ifs and buts there, and I think that Quebec sounds like it's tightening a lot for people that are in religious minority groups and minority groups in general. That doesn't sound very.
Yeah, I think the one difference I would. So first of all, I think where the comparison falls short, I would say Quebec, before the Parti Québécois, did have a history of right-wing nationalism in Quebec, and there's always been a sort of right-wing wing. That's not the case in Scotland. There's never has, from what I'm pretty sure, I'm 99% sure, there's never been a right-wing Scottish nationalist party.
No.
So I think that's an important difference. I think, well, what I would say, I think it's important to raise, actually, I have to talk about the language issue. I think I know a couple of people who live in Quebec, and they are English. They're Canadian, but they're English-speaking Canadians from another part of Canada who moved to Quebec, and they feel quite distressed about it. And it's quite interesting, actually. They feel that, as English speakers, I think she has said to me before. One particular friend has said to me before, she doesn't feel welcome in Quebec because of these language policies. So I think that's obviously. I completely support promoting the French language. I understand they are a minority within Canada. I get that, but to make English speaking, particularly, there are historic English speaking communities in Quebec. It's not a completely uniformly French speaking province. I think that is a step too far. But I think, interestingly, I would hope that wouldn't happen in Scotland.
Surely
there's never been a history of right-wing Scottish nationalism.
Surely you've got a risk of extreme left-wing nationalism, though. Surely it's the other side of the coin.
But then I guess. Well, I guess so. Let's go. This is obviously a lot. There's a lot of ifs and buts behind this, but let's hypothetically say there was a second independence referendum, and let's say it was exactly the same as Quebec in '95. No won with 51%, and yes lost. And then let's say again, lots of ifs and buts. Then that effectively killed the issue. Support for the SNP declined over 20 years. Then would we see the emergence of a sort of pro-Scottish nationalist, left-wing, anti-independence party? Maybe. I mean, it's a sort of
maybe, but also with the proportional representation system in base, if we were to get that, we're talking in a lot of ifs and buts. Me and you hope that by the time that we're reaching our parents' age, that PR is going to be enforcing across the whole of the UK. So surely it would be a more malleable and preferable place for a party like that to emerge as well.
Yeah, possibly. I mean, I guess my main point, I guess, is. No, it is really interesting to think about. I'm just, trying to process all this stuff.
Maybe we could do a little case study.
I just think, I think at the heart of it, I think what is interesting is just this idea that, do we need to have a second vote to kill the issue? And Quebec could suggest that if we did, it would kill the issue. But of course, this goes with the obvious point. If you hold a second vote, there is obviously the risk that Scotland votes yes. That is always a risk. So
which is a risk, and it is a significant economic shock and risk to the people that live there as well. Like, let's not sort of be a bit blasé about the topic. It's a very, very serious topic that has real life implications.
Yes, absolutely, which I think is why I understand. So it's very easy for me to say, it's a sort of academic stroke, I guess you could say, commentator. I'm commentating on these things. It's very easy for me to go.
We have a need to look at the surface level, don't we? Like,
it's very easy for me to sort of raise hypotheticals and sort of think, oh, what if we did this and this? But of course, it comes down to the fact this is a real life risk. This would be a huge gamble, particularly, let's say hypothetically, it was done by the Labour Party. you can imagine the way the press would treat that. It would just be an absolute. It would be a field day, wouldn't it? So I think, yeah. So obviously it comes with huge risks, but I just thought it was an interesting thing to ponder and contemplate.
Very fascinating. The only thing that I wanted to pick you up on, though, is the USA doesn't have an official language. Because if they were to have an official language, it would be Spanish. Because most people in the United States, more people in the United States speak Spanish than they do English.
Yes, sorry, you are absolutely right. Sorry about that.
Yeah.
No, you are right. Apologies.
Peddled by the Republicans, my friend.
Yeah, that was me being very lazy and anglophonic and not really thinking. Sorry.
You're more than welcome. I'm just here.
No, that's fine. No, that is actually a very important point to raise. Yes, no, you are right. Okay, so as I said, there was lots of stuff happening this week, but we did want to talk about something a bit lighter. And as you'll see by the title of our video this week, the final segment is how to keep sane. How to, particularly, I think so. Obviously, every PhD student has their own issues and own things. But I think if you're doing sort of something to do with politics, and if you're also a member of a party like we both are, it can be quite a lot and can be quite depressing if you're working on a PhD, and particularly if you have our viewpoint, it feels like the whole world is just burning around us and it feels terrible all the time. So you do need ways to sort of turn off from politics. And as I've said in the video, I think it's a very good line. Just keep yourself sane. Don't lose the plot. So we're just going to sort of, for the last sort of 10 minutes or so, we're just going to talk about, what we do when we're not PhDing or worrying about the world or working and all that stuff. So, very simple question, Katie. What do you do to keep sane?
What do I do to keep sane? Well, I will say that a habit that I developed when I got a dog was walking. I walk every day. At the weekend, I walk about an hour and a half, try and do 2-3 miles of a weekend on Saturday and Sunday to try and obviously keep my dogs well exercised, but also to get away from everything. During that time, I put my phone on silent. I'm not contactable. I just go for a nice big walk with my partner. We use it to talk about things, to debrief, and to just chill. So walking is something that I really use to kind of de-stress and to switch off. And I make sure that I have one every day if I can. Another thing that I'm really big into, this is me like getting out my nerd card now. I play D&D weekly as well with my friends. It's got into a really good way of us just catching up. We've obviously all got adult lives now where we all have big jobs and we all live across different parts of the world. So it's quite nice for us to get together on a Sunday and just sort of play D&D and just chill out and just, escape. We started D&D during COVID as like a form of escapism, really, to kind of get away from the real world and to all indulge in something that we love, which is Star Wars. So we started a Star Wars D&D, and that's one of the things that I do to relax. And another thing is, I wouldn't say I'm a gamer, but I go on my Xbox a lot and I game a lot because it helps me stay sane, and it helps me to just, after that day, I can close my laptop, disengage, and just sit in my living room with my friends that are online and kill bad people. And after a very stressful day, that's really nice. It stops me living out murderous tendencies in life. No, I'm joking. That's a joke. So yeah, that's kind of that's really what I do during my free time. Oh, and I've started trying to get into planting and having house plants, which nearly killed a couple. It's been touch and go, but we seem to be doing okay at the moment. So yeah, Adam, what do you do to chill?
To keep myself from going completely mad. So yeah, similar to you, I'm currently, as my PhD money runs out, I'm sort of forced to go live back with my parents, and they do own 2 dogs, so walking them is absolutely, it's a treat. I do love it, and it's great. I mean, I walk quite a lot with my granddad as well, and we just sort of moan about the world and how basically use it as a sort of most agony aunt session. We sort of moan at each other for about an hour, which is great. Other things, I'm a massive football fan. So one of my sort of, I think particularly during COVID, I really missed the social aspect of football. Going to games weekly. I'm a big Chelsea fan. I'm a particularly
same.
I'm fantastic. I'm an avid supporter of the women's team. I've got a season ticket for the women's team, so I go most weeks to watch them. And other things. I mean, I used to, obviously, same as you. I'm a big gamer. I wouldn't say I'm a big gamer. I'm very much. I'd say I'm a big casual gamer. Like I'm not particularly that intense about it, but it's just a very nice way to distract yourself, isn't it? And I think also, yeah, I think the final one would be probably traveling. Though COVID has kind of ruined that. I haven't been abroad since January 2020. The way I'm going somewhere in December 2022, this December,
Where are you
which I'm
going?
excited about. I'm going to Albania, bizarrely.
Mhm.
I'm going to watch Chelsea women are playing a Albanian team called Blasnia in the Champions League. So I decided to use that as an opportunity to go to a country which I've always wanted to visit because I think Albania is a very interesting country, has a fascinating history. So yeah, I'm going to go spend 4 days there and see what I can, see what I can find, explore.
Oh wow, that's fascinating. Let me know how you get on. Yeah,
Yes, absolutely.
I've only just started. I would agree with you traveling as well. I really enjoy traveling because I think it's really nice when you're reading about places to go and actually go and have a look at them and go and speak to people that live there and everything. So we didn't travel. Obviously, you couldn't travel during COVID. So the first time that we travelled, me and my partner, was when we went to America during summer. But we've got a trip coming up in November to Berlin because Berlin is one of my favourite places in the world. I will sit here and ship Berlin till the day I die. The history is fantastic. The people are great. And yeah, going for Christmas markets, absolutely incomparable. It's absolutely fantastic. So I'm actually, for the first time, I've been wanting to take him for the 7 years that we have been together. And I got 2 free flights to Europe from British Airways. And I was like, we're going to Berlin.
So I've been to I've been to Berlin once, and it was when I was interrailing, and it was good fun. It was very good fun. I do need to see, first of all, go back to Berlin. I just want to visit more of Germany as well because it's such a fascinating country.
Yeah, I agree. And also cannot recommend Poland enough as well. I had a wonderful time. I went to Warsaw and Krakow and I had a fantastic time. It was really good, really cheap as well.
Yes. Oh God, yeah. I mean, I went this is quite a funny story actually. So when the last time I went abroad, as I said, was January 2020, and this was sort of just but the month before COVID really sort of happened. So I was very lucky to get out when I did. And so basically what happened was it was December 2021, so a month before I went, and I decided after my first sort of semester of doing a PhD, I decided to, I'll treat myself. Obviously, being a PhD student, you don't have any money. So I went on Skyscanner, which is a flight comparison website for those who don't know, and I sort of put in the date. There was 1 week where there was no football, so I was like, all right, I'm going to put in sort of 4 days in that week. Where's the cheapest place to fly to? And it came up with Gdansk, Poland, and I was like, okay, I know nothing about Gdansk, Poland. Joyce hadn't actually heard of Gdansk, Poland before doing this. And then, yeah, I ended up spending 4 days in Gdansk, Poland, which actually, it was fascinating because I don't know if you know much about Gdansk as a place. It's technically where the first shots of the Second World War started, because the peninsula at the end of Gdansk is where the Germans fired their first bombardment of Poland. So I went there and I thought that was fascinating. It's also, I don't know how good your Polish history is, but Solidarność, the trade union which began the sort of end of communism.
I know about that because I went to a museum about
that.
Yes. It
was started in Gdansk, so I went to the shipyards where it started. I've learned about absolutely fascinating. So yeah, the moral of the story is when you go traveling, sometimes take a punt on a random place. You never know, you might end up loving it.
And also so one of my major tips for when you go traveling is ask the locals. And I know this sounds really, really light, but you can read endless travel blogs about everything. But the best experiences that I have had in any of these places are when you ask the locals where to go and what to see. And you can find so many little niche locally owned museums that don't have the resources to advertise, but have so many fascinating exhibits and insights. Like when I went to Warsaw, we stayed in a hostel and it was hilarious. Like it was in one of the really old buildings and it was great. Like, and this hostel was just, yeah, the people that owned it were just lovely. And I just went up to the front desk and I was like, hey, look, we've never been to Poland before. My partner studied Eastern European history and everything. I was like, well, this is what we're fascinated in. What is there in the local area that you don't show people? And I'm not sure whether this was Warsaw or Krakow. It might have been Krakow, but it doesn't matter. Anyway, there was the local former headquarters of the SS. and they turned it into the basement into a museum, but the top was like a hostel. And they were like, if you didn't know what was there, you wouldn't know. And the museum was so informative. It is one of the best and most respectful museums I have ever been to in my entire life. And if you were walking down the street, you would not have known that it was there. And you wouldn't have found out about it if you hadn't have asked the locals. And they basically said, oh, it's really important museum to us locally, because obviously it's very honest and it's owned and supported by these people. And it was so informative. And this is what I said, you can't, when you go as a tourist, you usually get the top layer, don't you? You don't get to go under into the actual nitty-gritty history. And I cannot recommend that enough. That museum was absolutely fascinating, and I believe it was in Krakow actually. But yeah, it was fascinating, and I got that just by asking somebody at the front desk, and they were like, "Yeah, nobody ever goes there," and it had a really nice memorial and everything. Really fascinating.
Yeah, I definitely want to visit more of Poland, because I think obviously Gdansk has a very unique. I think it feels. I think because of the sort of the historic influence from sort of places like Germany and more Northern European, it has a very unique feel to it, and I would love to see the rest, because obviously Poland's a huge country. Like,
yeah,
people forget how big it is, I think.
Yeah, people do forget how big it is. And also it was really interesting to see like the influences, and I always find it really interesting in those countries to see, the influences and the leftover from the Soviet Union, whilst also the Western influences that came afterwards. So we went into this one big place, and it was like we were on the tram. We were on a tram that was like older than us, because it had the USSR insignia on it, which was fascinating to us. So we were on this tram, and it was like such and such and such and such Ronald Reagan Plaza, and we were like, what? And we get off of this tram, and there's just this big statue of Ronald Reagan, and we were like, what? And obviously it was a plaza that they built after they became independent from the Soviet Union. It was so fascinating, but it had a really interesting mix of new buildings with old buildings from the city, like buildings that were hundreds of years old, but also buildings that were built in like the 50s and the 60s. And you can like walk down a street and walk through various time periods. Fascinating.
I mean, that does sound incredible, actually. That does sound really cool. So I think, so I think to summarize, go see the world, go travel. That's a great way to keep saying. So I think that's a good place to finish. I think. So next week, I'm not really sure what we're going to talk about next week. It feels like we're at the point now where it just feels like anything could happen, right? Like anything could go down in the next week.
Yeah, I don't know. We'll probably cross that bridge when we come to it.
I mean, there are some exciting things coming up in the next month. I know there's the second round of elections for the presidency in Brazil, Bolsonaro versus Lula. Which, oh god, I wish he'd won that first round.
Very controversial figures, which is very interesting.
Yeah, but less you've got to pick the lesser of two evils in that one. I think it really is. My god, it's not a particularly pretty sight. And obviously midterms are coming up as well, which I'm sure you'll want to really get into.
I'm very much into. Joe Biden's polling very well at the moment. He's very close to a 50% approval rating.
Yeah, it's. I mean, that is really how quickly he's turned that around.
Crazy.
It is remarkable. So lots of exciting stuff happening, and obviously, keep tuned, keep watching, keep liking and subscribing. We obviously, another thing I want to emphasize is we do, as much as we talk about serious stuff, we do want to do some lighter stuff as well. I want to do some stuff on I want to do some stuff on scary movies at the end of the month, because it's Halloween as well, for example. So if you have any ideas or suggestions of sort of more fun stuff we could talk about, please let us know, and we'll happily try and accommodate. So thank you so much. Thank you, Katie, for joining me.
Thanks, Adam.
Have a good day.